9 out of 10 people confessed, not because they were guilty, but because they were afraid not to. In the dungeons of medieval Europe, truth was measured not in evidence, but in screams. The church called it purification. The accountants called it justice. But every confession signed in blood was another entry in a legal system that equated pain with proof. So who truly paid for Europe's holiness? The sinners or the innocent who screamed the loudest? Chronicles fall silent, but the ledgers and the bones will answer. If you value the record, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The Iron Maiden was never a myth. It was a philosophy cast in iron, the conviction that salvation could be engineered. Its doors, shaped like a saint, promised mercy. Its spikes delivered truth. When the executioner closed them, the noise was slow, deliberate, the sound of theology turning into administration. Blood didn't spatter. It trickled neatly into a tray, collected like tithe. Inside those chambers, pain was not chaos. It was arithmetic. Every turn of the rack, every notch on the wheel had its record. Scribes waited nearby, quills ready to write down the moment when the prisoner's voice broke, the precise instant when truth was born. And if a confession arrived, the books balanced. No one asked whether it was real. In the logic of empire and church alike, pain could not lie. To modernize, it looks like madness. But in the 14th century, this was order, the machinery of salvation operating under the seal of law. Judges quoted scripture, torturers cited precedent, and both were paid by the same treasury. One sold indulgences for the soul, the other audited the body. Each confession meant the system worked, the court was justified, the faith proved pure. Some victims confessed to crimes that didn't exist. Others confessed to witchcraft, heresy, treason, words they barely understood. What mattered wasn't the content, but the act of submission. To confess was to become legible again to power, to return from the wilderness of doubt into the ledgers of the righteous. Torture didn't reveal truth. It manufactured obedience, and obedience could be taxed. In the archives of Bamberg and Toulouse, you can still find their signatures, crooked lines that quiver across parchment like scars, ink pools where hands trembled. Some end mid-stroke, where the pain became too much to finish a name. These aren't records of guilt, they're receipts. Proof that the system had consumed another soul and filed it away. When dawn broke above the dungeons, the streets outside filled with sermons about divine justice. But below, the echo of screams and the smell of iron told a different gospel, one written not in Latin, but in blood and fear. This was the price of confession, the transformation of suffering into bureaucracy, of faith into ledger. Yet, even as the smoke cleared from the sanctified torture halls, a darker question remained. If pain could create truth, what kind of world would need it? The Middle Ages did not need witnesses. It needed bodies, living, breaking, confessing. The body itself became the courtroom, the verdict, and the proof. When the rack began to turn, law and theology found their perfect instrument, a body that could be bent until it agreed. The rack wasn't chaos, it was precision. 4 beams of oak, iron cranks and ropes that turned confession into geometry. The victim was stretched inch by inch, ligaments snapping, joints opening like broken locks. Each turn of the wheel was measured, timed, recorded. Executioners were not brutes, they were technicians of truth. Their manuals specified exactly how far a man could be pulled before the spine gave way. Beyond that point, nothing the victim said could be trusted, not because of mercy, but because it wouldn't be legible anymore. The horror wasn't random, it was systematic. The rack was an institution, not a tool. It appeared in England, France, Germany, and the Papal States, standardized across borders like a bureaucratic export. Its logic was consistent. Stretch the body until the soul breaks, then call the moment of collapse revelation. Pain replaced investigation, and the sound of tearing flesh became a legal language, the grammar of fear that Europe understood perfectly. In England, Guy Fawkes met that language in 1606. After the failed gunpowder plot, he was taken to the Tower of London. The rack twisted him so far that his signature, once bold and defiant, became a shaking scrawl, barely recognizable. The parchment remains preserved, the record of a body converting agony into ink. To the state, it was evidence. To history, it was the anatomy of obedience. But medieval Europe had no monopoly on invention. As the rack pulled outward, another device, the scavenger's daughter, pushed inward. A grotesque opposite, it folded the human frame into submission. Invented under Henry VIII, it compressed its victims into a crouch so tight their blood vessels burst, eyes bulged, and noses bled until the face turned black with suffocation. This was cruelty inverted. The empire folding its subjects inward until they collapsed under their own confession. Both machines revealed the same principle. Truth was not discovered, it was extracted. The church claimed pain purified the soul. The crown claimed it purified the realm. And the ledger kept growing. Witnesses weren't needed when the body could testify on its own. The tortured became both question and answer. The executioner, the scribe, the priest, each played a role in transforming torment into narrative. Confession became product. The more elaborate the suffering, the more convincing the evidence. Inquisitors called it the art of persuasion. A cruel phrase, but in the archives you can still read the procedure lists. How many turns per minute, how long between breaks, when to pause for prayer. Every detail was codified. It wasn't rage, it was routine. To modernize, these rooms look barbaric. But to medieval logic, they were laboratories of faith, places where the invisible war between sin and salvation took physical form. When a man screamed, it wasn't pain. It was the devil being forced out. When he confessed, it wasn't surrender. It was spiritual order restored. The system justified itself completely. And like all perfect systems, it didn't need truth to function. It only needed consistency. The legal codes of the period, from the Constitutio, Criminalis Carolina in Germany, to the ordinances of the Inquisition, openly described pain as a procedural step. If suspicion was strong but not proven, the judge could order the question, meaning torture, to assist the truth in revealing itself. Truth didn't precede suffering. It was born from it. Pain became epistemology. The accused, once inside the chamber, understood this instantly. There was no winning. To deny was to endure. To confess was to survive, briefly. Because even when confession came, pardon rarely followed. The ritual had to be completed. The confession was evidence that the system worked, not that the victim was free. The church required that torture leave the body intact, enough for execution. It was theology disguised as logistics. Death was not the goal. Pain was. Death ended the spectacle. Pain prolonged it. And the longer it lasted, the more convincing it became. In this grim economy, agony was both currency and advertisement. Eyewitnesses described prisoners carried out longer by a cubit, stretched, dislocated, unrecognizable. They weren't killed. They were redesigned. To terrify others into obedience, one had to be made visibly, demonstrably broken. And so, every town, from Seville to Nuremberg, built chambers of confession beneath their courts, one above for law, one below for proof. The architecture itself became ideology. What's often forgotten is that many torturers believed they were serving God. They prayed before each session, asking forgiveness for the pain they were about to cause, convinced it was mercy in disguise. To them, a scream was grace, the soul purging its deceit through flesh. This moral inversion gave torture its endurance, the ability to survive not in spite of faith, but because of it. Even centuries later, when the Inquisition began to fade, the habit remained, the reflex to measure truth by endurance, to equate brokenness with honesty. You can still see its shadow in every interrogation cell that demands confession before proof. It's not medieval anymore, it's administrative, and it still speaks the same language: submit and be believed. Because once Europe learned to read pain as evidence, it never truly forgot how. By the time Europe learned to read pain as evidence, it also learned to stage it. Because in the medieval mind, justice wasn't meant to be quiet, it was meant to be seen. And the brightest stage of all was fire. Burning at the stake wasn't chaos or vengeance, it was choreography. Every detail was scripted: the priest's blessing, the judge's decree, the crowd's arrival, the placement of the wood. The condemned stood at the center like a living sermon, surrounded by an audience that didn't come to question the act. They came to witness their own salvation through someone else's agony. The church called it purification. The monarchy called it deterrence. But to the treasury, it was a civic event. The fire itself cost money: barrels of tar, bundles of pitch, wages for guards, payments for carpenters who built the platforms. Every flame had an invoice. Every sermon had a sponsor. In 1555, during Mary Tudor's Marian persecutions in England, more than 280 Protestants were burned alive over 3 years. The court records detail the purchases: rope, stakes, oil, nails, with the same precision as a merchant ledger. The state managed pain the way a banker manages interest: carefully, consistently, and for maximum visibility. To the spectators, it was theatre and theology fused. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the square, some praying, others eating, children perched on barrels for a better view. A few brought pieces of bread to bake near the fire and boast of it later. Because in a world ruled by the church, proximity to suffering felt like moral proof. You didn't have to be righteous, you just had to watch righteousness enforced. The condemned were paraded through the city first, tied to carts, their clothes stripped to the waist, their hair shaved. They were forced to carry candles or placards inscribed with their sins. It wasn't just execution, it was a ritual unmaking. The body was erased piece by piece before the fire even touched it. Green wood burned slower than dry. Executioners knew this. They stacked it deliberately to prolong agony, so the body would bake before it burned. Pitch and tar were poured for smoke, choking lungs before the flames reached skin. Sometimes, to make the process merciful, the priest offered a rope around the neck. If accepted, the victim would be strangled just before the fire reached the face. But mercy was never guaranteed. Mercy was a privilege earned by submission, not a right. The chronicles are full of names we remember: heretics, witches, traitors. But in between the lines are hundreds who had no names at all. They confessed to whatever was written before them, hoping the fire would be quick. It rarely was. Chroniclers describe blistering flesh, hair igniting, eyes bursting from heat. The smell of burning fat lingered in markets for days. Some wrote that even livestock refused to pass the site for weeks afterward. But for rulers, this wasn't just punishment. It was propaganda, a spectacle to remind the masses that pain belonged to the disobedient. It wasn't the death of one heretic. It was the preservation of millions of silent believers. And silence was the empire's safest currency. In Germany and France, the church integrated the ritual into the calendar. Burnings were announced on feast days. Following Mass, the crowd moving seamlessly from prayer to execution. Faith and flame intertwined until one justified the other. The priest's Latin blended with the crackle of wood. And the audience, terrified, obedient, became complicit. There's a psychological precision to this cruelty. Fire cleanses, fire reveals. By turning it into policy, the church made horror feel holy. People didn't see themselves as witnesses to torture. They saw themselves as guardians of order. To doubt the ritual was to invite the same fate. Even the architecture reflected the ideology. Town squares were designed with raised stone platforms and open sightlines, ensuring everyone could see. The same spaces that hosted coronations and festivals also hosted executions. Celebration and annihilation, two faces of one faith. In Seville, inquisitors built an elaborate wooden scaffold called the quemadero, literally the burning place. It could hold dozens at once. Spectators gathered from miles away. Merchants sold food. Priests read lists of the condemned aloud. The ritual began at dawn and ended when the last ember died. When chroniclers described it, their tone was never one of horror. It was triumph. They called it the Great Cleansing. It's tempting to see this as distant barbarity, but look closer at the psychology. The Theatre of Flames wasn't just about killing heretics. It was about rehearsing obedience, teaching an entire civilization how to align fear with faith. The crowd learned what not to say, what not to believe, and above all, what not to question. Every burning was a sermon, pain as pedagogy. And yet, among the ashes, a question smoldered, one that neither the church nor the crown dared to answer. If truth is born from suffering, what happens when the innocent burn better than the guilty? Cruelty is not most frightening when it is loud, but when it is organized. By the late Middle Ages, pain itself had an administration. every kingdom, every bishopric, every free city had its torturers, its clerks, its tariff lists for how much each confession cost to extract. Justice had become paperwork, and agony had its accountants. Inside the inquisitorial chambers of Spain, Germany, and France, every tool had a serial logic. A rack, for instance, required 2 assistants, 1 notary, and 1 examiner of conscience. A single session could last precisely as long as the body might endure without mortal wound. The phrasing wasn't moral, it was managerial. Even suffering had boundaries, not to protect the victim, but to preserve the asset. A dead prisoner could not confess. An unbroken one could not convince. So the state learned to calibrate pain, enough to extract, never enough to destroy. This was the invisible innovation of medieval Europe, the transformation of torture into procedure. It wasn't rage or vengeance, it was governance. And the men who ran it were not monsters from legend. They were bureaucrats in robes and record keepers in candlelight. They tallied agony like tax. One of the earliest surviving manuals, Directorium Inquisitorum, 1376, outlines the system with chilling neutrality. The judge must question with persistence, it advises, but avoid excess that brings death before confession. Pain was not a sin, it was a method. Each body was a file, each scream a form of compliance. And once confession was written and witnessed, the case could be closed with satisfaction. Behind every confession we remember, from heretics in Toulouse to witches in Bamberg, stood clerks with quills. They weren't there to stop the torture. They were there to document its rhythm. When the rope tightened, when the prisoner fainted, when the truth arrived. Every detail entered into the register, stamped and signed. In some courts, victims even paid their own torture fees afterward, reimbursement for the services rendered by the state. Few details better summarize the medieval theology of power. The sinner not only suffered, but financed his purification. From Spain's Inquisition to England's Star Chamber, the rules remained consistent. Pain was divided into degrees, like taxation brackets. First, the verbal threat. Second, the instruments displayed. Third, the first touch. Only at the 4th degree was full torment permitted, always under prayer, always with moderation. Moderation, the word that turns cruelty into virtue. When written in Latin, it looked almost divine. The church oversaw every stage. Before each session, a priest blessed the tools and prayed for divine truth to emerge. When the screams began, the notary bowed his head. The ritual was a fusion of faith and formality, the sacred converted into system. By baptizing bureaucracy, the Inquisition achieved what no empire before it had done. It made suffering sustainable. Records from 16th century Spain show meticulous accounts. Iron weights ordered from Seville, hemp ropes replaced monthly, payments to blacksmiths for sharpening spikes, oil for lamps. Nothing escaped notation. Even the smell of burning fat, described by scribes as testimony of truth fulfilled, became part of official record. Where Rome once recorded taxes and tributes, the church now recorded cries. Both were revenue. To modern readers, it's easy to imagine torturers as sadists. But many were indifferent, civil servants doing their work between prayers and meals. They left the chamber at dusk, washed their hands, went home to families. Their language stripped emotion from the act. A man was not torn apart, he was examined to completion. A woman did not scream, she gave evidence under duress. In this phrasing, morality dissolved, only metrics remained. This depersonalization was the system's strength. Cruelty thrives not in chaos, but in order. When violence becomes data, no one feels responsible. Everyone is simply doing their part. The inquisitor served faith. The clerk served record. The executioner served the law. Together they built a machine that could devour people indefinitely without ever feeling monstrous. Across Europe, archives from the 15th to 17th centuries show identical handwriting on different continents. The ink is steady, the tone professional, the words exact. One entry reads, "The accused remained obstinate until the 3rd degree. Upon the 4th, he admitted to the charge and was reconciled to the faith." There's no blood on the page, but you can feel it between the lines. This was not medieval brutality. This was modern logic in medieval form. Pain became a resource to be optimized. Efficiency replaced empathy. And once the process was perfected, it could be exported to colonies, to courts, to prisons, yet unbuilt. The blueprint was eternal. Standardize suffering, regulate confession, invoice the victim. Even kings began to borrow the model. In France, royal inquisitors kept dual ledgers, one for heresy, one for treason. In both, the handwriting was the same. The church had invented not only torture, but documentation. Power no longer needed rage, it had paperwork. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the dungeons had become archives. Pain was inked, catalogued, bound. The screams of thousands turned into the quietest sound in history, the scratch of quill on parchment. That sound, more than the fire or the wheel, is what built Europe's conscience of order. The bureaucrats called it justice. The priests called it salvation. But the bones that filled those ledgers tell another story. A continent that confused record with righteousness and cruelty with control. And the question that rises from every page still cuts through the centuries. When the system makes suffering efficient, who then dares to call it evil? If the rack defined how men were broken, the bridle defined how women were silenced. Because in the empire of pain, gender was not spared, it was organized. The medieval world had its own logic. Men were punished to confess, women were punished to obey. The branx, or scold's bridle, was forged from that logic. An iron cage fitted over a woman's head with a long metal bit forced into the mouth. The device looked crude, almost absurd, but its design was meticulous. The plate pressed against the tongue, sometimes studded with spikes, so that any attempt to speak tore flesh. Some models were engraved with verses from scripture, as if silence itself had divine approval. The women chosen for the bridal weren't heretics or traitors. They were wives, widows, and servants, accused of gossip, blasphemy, or simply talking too loudly. In a society where speech was male property, a woman's voice became rebellion. The punishment was designed not just to wound, but to erase her from conversation. Public humiliation was the true weapon. In market squares across England and Scotland, victims were paraded through the streets, the iron mask clanging as they walked. Children jeered, men spat, neighbors threw filth. Sometimes the bridle was chained to a post, leaving the woman standing for hours in rain or freezing wind. She could neither cry out nor swallow. Even breathing was agony. Records from Newcastle in 1650 describe a woman so chastened by the branks that she could speak no more thereafter. The chronicler wrote this as triumph. The silence of one woman was the harmony of the town. In these spectacles, the crowd's laughter was not random cruelty. It was political theatre. Humor disguised domination. Mockery turned violence into moral lesson. And as the crowd laughed, they learned what the state needed them to learn, that speech could be owned, and silence could be holy. The church justified it through scripture. The tongue is a fire, and the courts echoed the metaphor with iron. Law, faith, and metallurgy conspired to make silence a virtue. Each woman's humiliation became a sermon about obedience. It worked better than any sermon from the pulpit. For those who resisted, worse devices waited. In some towns, the branks evolved into the cucking stool, a wooden chair mounted on a lever by the riverbank. The condemned woman was tied to it and dunked repeatedly in cold water to cool her temper. Each submersion erased her voice further, turning defiance into drowning. The townspeople called it discipline, but in truth it was baptism inverted, purification through humiliation. Economically, the system made sense. A woman's body was cheap, replaceable labor. If she disobeyed, the fine for her punishment went to the parish, a small civic profit from public shame. Gender itself became part of governance. Men's bodies were stretched, women's bodies were silenced. Both produced the same outcome, submission made visible. From England's market towns to Italy's convents, the lesson was consistent. A woman's virtue was measured not by what she said, but by how well she could endure without speaking. Pain was no longer just a sentence. It was pedagogy. It taught the community what the law dared not write aloud, that truth had a male voice and suffering had a female one. In rare cases, even noble women faced the same ritual. One 16th century record from Dundee describes a merchant's wife accused of unseemly speech. She wore the bridle for 3 days and nights, fed only by spoon through the side of the mask. Her husband paid the blacksmith's fee, reimbursement for the correction of her soul. He noted it proudly in his household ledger. Psychologically, these punishments worked because they were communal. Each act of shaming reinforced collective complicity. To laugh was to participate. To stay silent was to survive. And so, entire towns learned to side with power, not because they were cruel, but because they were afraid to be next. Modern readers recoil at the brutality, but what made the bridle endure wasn't its iron, it was its idea. That control begins not with the body, but with the mouth. Even today, echoes of it survive, not in metal, but in language, in ridicule, in the social reflex to punish a woman who speaks too much, too sharply, too freely. The branks was a relic of its age, but the silence it enforced still moves through time. You can hear it in the missing testimonies, the unsigned letters, the erased names in the archives. For every document that records a punishment, there are 100 that omit the woman entirely. History remembers kings who conquered and priests who judged. It remembers tools of iron and laws of parchment. But it forgets the simplest invention of all, the one that required no blade, no flame, no rope, a cage around the mouth, and a world that called it justice. And so, the question that haunted every silent street remains. When half a population learns to fear its own voice, how long before the rest mistake that silence for peace? By the 15th century, torture had left the dungeon and entered the square. Punishment was no longer confined to shadows. It was staged in daylight, rehearsed like theatre. Every execution was a civic event, every scream a public message. Rome had its circuses, medieval Europe had its scaffolds, and both served the same purpose, to remind the crowd who ruled the body. The garrote, the pillory, and the stocks turned cities into classrooms of fear. Each tool taught a different lesson. The garrote taught surrender, the pillory taught shame, the stocks taught endurance. Together they formed a grammar of obedience that every citizen could read. In Spain, the garrote, an iron collar mounted on a post, delivered justice through silence. The condemned was seated, the collar locked around the neck, and a screw at the back turned slowly until a metal pin crushed the throat or spine. It was efficient, reusable, and solemn. The crowd gathered, not to cheer, but to watch stillness overtake the human face. One turn, two turns, then a shudder, and the lesson was learned. The victim's body stiffened in seconds, his head tilted as if in prayer. Executions could number in the hundreds per year, but the tone was always the same. Order restored. The garrote was not chaos, it was bureaucracy in motion. Inventories list the devices by city, each maintained by royal contract. Blacksmiths were paid to keep the screws oiled and functional. Clergy received fees for attending, reading final rites, certifying death. Every participant was compensated. Pain was an economy, circulated, recorded, taxed. In England, the pillory and stocks performed another ritual, humiliation as purification. The condemned were locked by neck, hands or feet and displayed for hours or days. The sentence might read, to stand in the pillory for 2 market days and be a spectacle to all good Christians. So the crowd became judge, jury, and executioner. Rotten fruit, dung, stones, boiling liquids. Everything the mob threw became part of the verdict. The accused were not meant to die, they were meant to disintegrate socially. A 1623 London record tells of a man accused of fraud, whose skull was crushed by a stone while in the pillory. His death was ruled accidental. The court simply noted that public passion exceeded the bounds of correction. No one was punished. The people had played their role too well. In this theatre, the state and its citizens shared authorship. The judges wrote the script, but the mob performed it. Justice was participatory, and by participating, the public became complicit, transforming violence into virtue. When the crowd laughed, or threw, or jeered, it wasn't rebellion, it was consensus. The system had succeeded when cruelty looked like civic duty. Even across the Atlantic, in colonial America, the same rituals survived. Winter frost cracked exposed flesh, summer heat blistered it. Prisoners fainted under flies and sun, but still they stood, living warnings at the center of the marketplace. Children learned early, power always has an audience. Obedience begins with spectacle. These punishments blurred the boundary between entertainment and enforcement. Festivals often followed executions. Songs were written about famous trials. In Paris, crowds purchased seats with better views. Vendors sold bread, wine, and pamphlets describing the crimes of the condemned. The scaffold became an altar where the law fed its faithful with performance. The choreography of death served theology as well as politics. To see justice enacted was to reaffirm that divine order ruled the world. Every gasp, every convulsion, every final prayer formed a script of submission. The condemned played the role of sinner, the executioner the arm of God, and the audience the congregation. It was theatre so convincing that few ever questioned its script. Even mercy was staged. When a prisoner was granted strangulation before burning, the crowd applauded. When an executioner struck cleanly, he was praised for skill. Pity became another instrument of control, proof that cruelty could be moral when measured correctly. It was not sadism, it was choreography. And the people learned the steps by heart. The architecture of European cities still remembers this logic. In plazas where tourists now drink coffee, gallows once stood. The stones beneath bear faint grooves where stakes were driven, where ropes frayed, where ash fell. Cities built on justice were, quite literally, built on execution. This merging of spectacle and law made torture self-sustaining. It no longer needed belief to survive, it only needed an audience. As long as people came to watch, the system had purpose. As long as pain was visible, power was visible. That was the equation. And yet, within that choreography, there was always a paradox. Every public death risked creating sympathy. Every scream risked echoing too far. To manage that danger, the state refined its performance, making punishment precise, timed, and narratively satisfying. The victim had to die just long enough for the crowd to understand, but not long enough for them to care. The Middle Ages perfected that balance. They turned agony into instruction, and instruction into loyalty. No sermon could reach so many hearts so quickly as a burning stake or a turning wheel, and no government could exist without teaching its people to find order in another's suffering. But as the flames faded and the blood dried, a more subtle cruelty was waiting, one that no longer needed crowds or squares. A new economy was forming beneath the gallows, one that would monetize the machinery of death itself. Every execution had a market. Every death fed a system. The scaffold, like the cathedral, required funding, rope, timber, guards, and wages for the men who turned law into spectacle. But beneath those official expenses was a deeper economy, the trade in human pain. In medieval Europe, punishment wasn't only a ritual of order, it was an industry. The coffers of towns and kingdoms swelled each time a sentence was carried out. Vendors set up stalls, innkeepers raised prices, and magistrates collected fees. When a heretic burned or a thief swung, commerce bloomed. Death paid. The coffin torture illustrates this logic with chilling precision. It was, in theory, a form of execution, an iron cage shaped to fit the human body, often barely large enough to breathe. In practice, it was a business model. Blacksmiths forged the cages, woodcutters supplied the gallows, tanners sold leather straps, and guards rented space in the square to hang the condemned in view. The longer the corpse remained on display, the greater the crowd, the higher the profit. Some cities charged merchants for placement near the viewing area. Suffering generated foot traffic. In Nuremberg and Paris, bodies left hanging in these cages for weeks drew pilgrims and gawkers. Local taverns called them miracle weeks. Food and wine sales doubled. Children begged for relics. A lock of hair, a piece of chain, a nail from the post. The church denounced superstition, but it taxed the gatherings anyway. Even moral outrage had revenue. The logic extended to torture chambers. When instruments broke, they were repaired with civic funds. When torturers worked overtime, they received bonuses. Every confession had a price: ink, paper, candles, and labor. Municipal ledgers list payments. 2 florins to the executioner for 3 turns of the wheel. 5 to the clerk for writing confession and sentence. Justice had an hourly rate. The most profitable punishments were those that took time. The knee splitter, 2 iron plates lined with spikes, screwed tighter until bone shattered, could last for hours. It rarely killed, but it ruined. And that was the point. Permanent injury meant permanent memory. The victim crawled for life, living proof that the law worked. The city needed such proof. It was advertisement. The Spanish Inquisition perfected the economics of endurance. They called it auto da fe, act of faith. But the logistics resembled a fairground. Processions marched, banners waved, sermons thundered, merchants sold indulgences beside food stalls. Each burning was an opportunity for spectacle and sale. The Empire of Faith had learned the empire's oldest rule: ideology must fund itself. Even the instruments became assets. Executioners kept their own arsenals: racks, pincers, branding irons, which they rented out to smaller towns. Some carried traveling kits, moving from village to village like craftsmen of agony. The church licensed them. Their profession was hereditary. In some regions, the office of torturer came with housing, pension, and tax exemption. The man who crushed bones was, legally, a civil servant. In this light, cruelty appears not as chaos, but as craft. The garrote, the wheel, the stake, each was a technology refined by demand. When an empire wants order, it pays for efficiency, and when efficiency becomes art, atrocity becomes invisible. The ledgers make this clear. One surviving account from Augsburg, 1589, details an execution of 3 witches. 26 thalers for the ropes and chains, 4 for the wood, 3 for oil and pitch, 1 for the priest, and 2 for the refreshments of the guards. No entry for the victims. They were not costs, they were content. Every punishment sustained a network of tradesmen, smiths, tanners, scribes, judges, priests. Each one earned from the pain of another. This was complicity, disguised as routine. No one felt guilty, because everyone benefited. The system didn't need villains, it needed consumers. To understand medieval cruelty, you must follow the money. The spectacle of suffering existed because it was profitable, morally, politically, and economically. A burning erased dissent, affirmed faith, and funded the next fire. A beheading cleaned the books of rebellion and paid the executioner's wage. Pain had yield. Even death had a secondary market. Anatomists bribed guards for corpses. Surgeons paid for bones. Alchemists bought ashes, believing they contained traces of divine essence. What religion called sacred, commerce called valuable. And the two agreed that nothing, not even a body, should go to waste. In time, the logic of profit replaced the logic of mercy entirely. Cities began scheduling executions on market days. Officials argued it kept order. Merchants knew it kept customers. The square became a dual altar, one for justice, one for trade. To the crowd, they were indistinguishable. This is how power hides itself, by convincing people that cruelty is not only necessary, but productive. That pain maintains prosperity, and suffering secures peace. And when the screams fade, the balance sheets remain, proof that everything was justified, because everything was paid for. Yet, in the margins of those ledgers, written in faded ink, sometimes appears a single line: excess wood unsold. A quiet detail, but haunting. It means that day fewer bodies burned than expected. For once the business of pain made a loss. And somewhere, perhaps, someone in the crowd felt a silence that didn't belong. The uneasy awareness that a system built on agony must always keep burning, or else risk revealing the truth beneath its ash. That peace, in this world, was never the absence of violence. It was simply the pause between transactions. By the 16th century, Europe no longer needed fire to make people obey. It had discovered something more efficient, devices that could break the will without killing the body. If the rack and the wheel were instruments of spectacle, these were instruments of administration, small, portable, precise. The thumbscrews, the chair of nails, the iron gag, each was designed not to end a life, but to erase a voice. They represented the evolution of torture from theatre to technology, from fire and crowd to screw and hinge. Cruelty became compact, measurable, and, most dangerously, forgettable. The thumbscrew was no larger than a book clasp. Two iron plates tightened by a simple screw. The victim's fingers were placed between them, and the handle turned. Each twist crushed bone and burst nails with a sound like splintering wood. Records from the Scottish witch trials describe interrogators adjusting pressure as one might tune a lute. The goal was precision, not blood. You could hold a man's truth between your fingertips. It was torture distilled, pain without spectacle, agony without chaos. In Germany's prisons, the device became so common that thieves begged for hanging instead. One court clerk wrote, "Many would rather die than endure another turn." The tool required no stage, no audience, only patience and paperwork. This was cruelty adapted to bureaucracy. Then came the chair of nails. At first glance, it looked like furniture. A wooden seat with armrests and backrest. Only up close did you see the hundreds of spikes covering every surface. The prisoner was stripped and strapped down, their own body weight forcing the points deeper. Some versions were heated red hot before use. The bleeding was slow, steady, perfectly controlled. Death was rare. Confession was common. What made this device terrifying wasn't the pain, but its logic. You couldn't move. You couldn't faint. You could only wait, pinned by your own flesh. The interrogator didn't need to shout. He could simply sit nearby, reading scripture or writing notes while the victim's blood filled the grooves in the wood. It was torture reduced to administration, agony made ergonomic. The iron gag took silence to its extreme. A metal plate was forced deep into the mouth, pressing down the tongue, sometimes with a spike to pierce it if the victim spoke. Breathing scraped the throat. Swallowing was impossible. The device didn't demand confession. It demanded nothing. It taught that some truths are better left unspoken. In 18th century Saxony, prisoners were paraded wearing the gag, drooling blood while crowds jeered. They weren't executed. They were erased. Speech itself became contraband. The state no longer needed you to confess. It only needed you to be silent. These tools marked a transition from public fear to private compliance. Where the stake created martyrs, the gag created ghosts. No flames, no sermons, no applause, only absence. Power had learned to work quietly. The philosophy behind them was chillingly modern. Control the body and the voice follows. Control the voice and the mind follows. No revolution begins without words, and no rebellion survives without speech. So the empire targeted the mouth, the hands, the breath, the instruments of dissent. Even language adapted. Confession gave way to examination. Pain became correction. Executioner became servant of order. Each euphemism dulled the violence, allowing society to keep its conscience clean. By changing vocabulary, they changed perception, and once cruelty was invisible, it became eternal. Economically, these devices were efficient. They required little manpower, minimal cleanup, and produced fast results. Torture had become scalable. One interrogator could process dozens a day. The state found its perfect equilibrium. Fear, industrialized. Obedience, mechanized. Psychologically, it was genius. Pain confined to small spaces creates a special kind of despair. Without audience or chaos, the victim's only companion was the sound of metal. The slow, rhythmic turn of a screw. No one could witness it. No one could interrupt it. The silence itself became part of the torture. Modern readers often imagine medieval cruelty as noisy, screams, fire, chaos. But by the 1600s, the most efficient violence was almost soundless. The church no longer needed fire to cleanse heresy. It needed a room with a lock. The state no longer needed execution squares. It needed files, stamps, and silence. You can trace this evolution in the archives. The earliest records describe fire and spectacle. By the Enlightenment, they describe restraint and interrogation. The tone shifts from religious to bureaucratic, from zeal to routine. Human cruelty didn't decline. It professionalized. The chair of nails and the iron gag were the ancestors of the solitary cell, the padded room, the soundproof interrogation chamber. Each represents the same principle. You don't need to destroy a person to control them. You only need to make them invisible. By the late 17th century, the audience for punishment had vanished. The crowd no longer watched. The clerk did. The scream no longer echoed through the city. It stayed on paper, as a line in a report. The subject complied. And in that silence, Europe found something it had never known before. A form of cruelty so quiet it could pass for civilization. When fire and iron grew too heavy for conscience, Europe discovered a lighter weapon: laughter. By the 17th century, the spectacle of torture had begun to exhaust even the faithful. The church feared martyrdom. The crown feared sympathy. So, punishment evolved again, not into mercy, but into mockery. Pain became a joke that everyone could share without guilt. Enter the drunkard's cloak. At first glance, it looked absurd. A beer barrel hollowed out, holes cut for the head and arms. But inside that farce was a philosophy. The condemned, usually a beggar or labourer caught drunk in public, was shoved into the barrel and paraded through the streets. The wood stank of old ale and sweat. Its weight crushed the shoulders. The victim staggered, unable to sit, the crowd roaring with laughter. Children threw stones, taverns emptied to watch. The punishment rarely drew blood. It didn't need to. Its purpose was to turn a man into a walking joke. The laughter was the real execution. Because ridicule doesn't just humiliate the victim, it recruits the audience. When people laugh, they join the side of power without realizing it. The state no longer had to burn bodies to assert control. It only had to turn crime into comedy. Across England and Germany, the drunkard's cloak became the preferred moral correction. In Newcastle, records from 1655 mention dozens of offenders, so chastised for public example. Each parade wound through the market for hours, until exhaustion made the culprit collapse. Some died from dehydration, others from frostbite when the damp wood froze to skin. But the chronicles called these deaths accidents, because laughter, by definition, could not be cruel. This was the quiet genius of ridicule. It hid violence behind entertainment. Where the stake made citizens complicit through fear, the barrel made them complicit through amusement. Mockery democratized punishment. Everyone got to participate, and everyone walked away clean. The cucking stool followed the same pattern. A woman accused of gossip or infidelity was tied to a wooden chair attached to a long beam and dunked into a river or pond. Each plunge was met with applause. The ritual blurred the line between baptism and punishment. Water replaced fire. Laughter replaced prayer. The crowd shouted hymns between taunts, convinced they were performing a moral duty. It was cruelty disguised as comedy. A sermon rewritten as slapstick. Records from the town of Shrewsbury list payments for repair of the ducking stool alongside church maintenance costs. Faith and ridicule existed on the same ledger. The same carpenters who built pews built punishment. To understand the politics of ridicule is to see how deeply the medieval mind intertwined faith, fear, and fun. Punishment wasn't just correction. It was entertainment that reaffirmed social order. The poor, the drunk, the outspoken, the foreign, all became characters in the empire's morality play. Each humiliation reminded the audience of their own position in the hierarchy. It said, "You could be next, but not today." That was the psychological contract between ruler and ruled. And in that contract, laughter became the cheapest form of control. It cost nothing. It left no scars that could indict the system. It spread easily, requiring no priest, no court, no warrant, only a crowd. From these medieval rituals of mockery emerged a cultural reflex that still survives. The idea that ridicule is harmless, that shame is deserved, that humiliation is a form of justice. The Inquisition had its fires. Modernity would have its gossip columns and public stocks of opinion. The technology changed, the instinct did not. Ridicule, like fire, purges, but unlike fire, it leaves the body intact and the soul uncertain. The victim walks away, but never escapes. Shame doesn't end when the laughter fades. It lingers in the mind, replayed endlessly in memory. That's why the drunkard's cloak worked so well. Its pain wasn't in the flesh, but in the echo. The realization that everyone had witnessed your undoing and enjoyed it. For rulers, ridicule offered something no execution ever could: sustainability. A person can only be burned once, but they can be mocked forever. And a society that learns to laugh at the powerless will never question the powerful. In the archives of London's Guildhall, a small note from 1672 records the expense of a new barrel for the correction of inebriates. The cost, 2 shillings, a cheap price for moral order, even cheaper for complicity. When Europe replaced fire with laughter, it didn't grow kinder, it grew cleverer. Public cruelty no longer needed blood to survive. It only needed a stage and an audience willing to smile. And so, as the Middle Ages waned and modernity dawned, the world congratulated itself on its civility, not realizing that the stage had only changed its lighting. The actors remained the same. The play continued. The tools were smaller, the wounds cleaner, the silence deeper. But the purpose never changed: to teach the living that dissent was ridiculous. And somewhere, behind every jeer and every cheer, the same ancient voice whispered, the voice of the empire that once burned heretics, now content to drown laughter in ale. Obey, and you will be spared the joke. Every system of cruelty eventually seeks perfection. By the late Middle Ages, torture had achieved its final form. Not the extraction of confession, nor the performance of justice, but the artful unmaking of the human body itself. If the rack stretched obedience and the gag manufactured silence, then the wheel and the claw reduced people to symbols, broken icons of divine punishment. The Spanish tickler was one such masterpiece. A small iron rake, curved like an animal's paw, its prongs were drawn across the flesh with slow precision. Heated red hot, it tore muscle from bone, peeling away skin like parchment. Executioners used it on the back, the face, even the thighs, anywhere the crowd could see. It was used across Spain, France, and the German states, most famously by the Inquisition. Survivors were rare. Those who lived did so disfigured, both physically and morally. Proof to the Church that sin left marks. The device's genius was symbolic. It mimicked creation in reverse. Where God shaped man from dust, the tickler reshaped him into agony. Every stroke was an argument. That the body could not belong to itself. That the flesh was evidence of the soul's corruption. When the skin came off, so did dignity. The condemned became a living manuscript, rewritten by heat and iron. But even this horror had a rival. The breaking wheel, sometimes called the Catherine wheel. It was the grand finale of medieval punishment, the apotheosis of pain. The victim was tied to a wooden wheel, limbs spread along the spokes. Then came the iron cudgel. One blow at a time, bones were shattered from the feet upward, 8 to 10 fractures before the mercy stroke. In some regions, the victim was woven into the wheel afterward and hoisted on a pole, left to die over days. The body twisted by sun and wind, limbs bent backward, ribs exposed. The wheel turned slowly, a spectacle visible for miles. Crowds gathered not to rebel, but to remember. Chroniclers recorded great awe among onlookers, not horror, but fascination. Because the breaking wheel did not merely kill, it displayed divine order. Every broken limb was a metaphor for sin dismembered, the human shape itself dismantled in the name of purity. To rulers, it proved their authority absolute. To believers, it proved God's will inscrutable. Art followed. Paintings of saints on the wheel filled churches. Martyrs and criminals shared the same posture, stretched, cruciform, illuminated by pain. In theology, this symmetry was perfection. Sin punished, virtue proven, both through suffering. In politics, it was genius. The state and the church no longer needed to explain cruelty. They only needed to frame it as sacred. The wheel was both punishment and parable. It taught that destruction could be beautiful when justified by order. The same principle that guided cathedral architecture, symmetry, proportion, awe, also guided the mechanics of execution. The torturer and the sculptor shared a devotion to craft. Both shaped material until it reflected the divine. But amid this theatre of righteousness, a quiet shift occurred. Not everyone believed. By the 16th century, a new question began to circulate among philosophers, whispered in letters and pamphlets. If virtue requires cruelty, is it still virtue? If faith demands spectacle, is it still faith? This doubt was dangerous, not because it was false, but because it made sense. Still, the wheel kept turning. In France, a royal assassin named François Ravaillac was torn by red-hot pincers, then broken and quartered in 1610 before a crowd of thousands. The chronicler's tone was not of pity, but admiration for the executioner's endurance. The artisans of pain had become celebrities of justice, and yet even they began to falter. As Enlightenment ideas spread, whispers grew that the spectacle of cruelty demeaned civilization. But the old order defended itself with familiar rhetoric. Punishment was purification, discipline was duty, and every scream was a hymn to law. Old habits die hardest when they are profitable. The irony is that the age of reason didn't abolish the logic of the wheel. It refined it. When guillotines replaced cudgels, the rationale was not mercy, but efficiency. Clean death was simply cleaner administration. The state still needed visibility. It only changed its stage lighting. The body was still a message. It was merely written faster. Looking back, it's easy to condemn the wheel, the claw, the flame. But to understand them is to see the oldest truth of power, that cruelty is never accidental. It is designed, budgeted, and moralized. The tickler was a theology. The wheel was a philosophy. And together they completed the work that the Iron Maiden began, turning justice into art, and art into obedience. The chronicles end their descriptions with a simple phrase: order restored. But in the soil beneath those scaffolds lie bones that spell a different truth. That order achieved through annihilation is not stability, but silence. And silence, in the hands of power, is the most perfect art of all. When the fires dimmed and the racks rusted, Europe congratulated itself. The Enlightenment had arrived, bringing reason, science, and law. No more inquisitors, no more confessions under flame, only courts, prisons, and reform. But beneath the rhetoric of progress, The old logic still breathed. The faces changed. The machinery did not. Pain simply found new paperwork. The 18th century claimed to abolish torture, yet it only privatized it. Where once crowds had cheered in plazas, now stone walls hid the same rituals in silence. The spectacle of agony turned inward. The gallows became the penitentiary. The pyre became the cell. Europe didn't end cruelty. It rationalized it. And in doing so, it made it eternal. The guillotine is the perfect emblem of this transition. When it appeared in 1792, it was hailed as humane, swift, mechanical, impartial. The philosopher Joseph Ignace Guillotin promised that decapitation shall be as painless as lightning. Reformers celebrated it as progress. An end to the chaos of torture, a victory of reason over barbarism. But step closer, and the illusion breaks. The guillotine didn't erase spectacle, it refined it. Crowds still gathered in Parisian squares. Vendors sold souvenirs. Children climbed lampposts to see the blade fall. Drums rolled. Names were announced. The same choreography of death continued, now under the banner of enlightenment. Pain was no longer a confession of sin. It was the enforcement of equality. The condemned were no longer heretics, but citizens. And yet, the state's right to kill remained unquestioned. Only the justification changed, from salvation unto sovereignty. The machine didn't free humanity from cruelty. It merely granted cruelty a cleaner conscience. Philosophers sensed the hypocrisy. Cesare Beccaria warned that torture confounds the innocent with the guilty. Yet, governments kept it in new forms. Interrogation rooms replaced dungeons. Scientific experiments replaced divine trials. Psychiatry studied the mind as inquisitors once studied the soul. Every age builds its own tools to measure suffering and calls it progress. In France, the same revolution that shouted liberty filled its prisons faster than any king. In England, workhouses replaced public scaffolds where hunger, not flame, broke the poor. The industrial age added its precision. Prisons scheduled meals, silences, and even thoughts. Time itself became the new whip. Michel Foucault would later call it the discipline of the clock, an invisible rack turning hour by hour. The Enlightenment taught that pain could be reformed, quantified, even therapeutic. Doctors replaced priests, surgeons replaced torturers. The vocabulary changed. Treatment, correction, rehabilitation. But the equation remained. Pain equals obedience. Only now it wore the mask of medicine. The archives from 19th century asylums read like the Inquisition's ledgers, rewritten in clinical Latin, patients restrained for their safety. Applied cold water for moral clarity. Electric current administered to induce calm. Each entry justified by reason, not religion, but the result was the same: silence. The body as evidence, the body as proof. The same logic that once built racks now built psychiatric wards. The same bureaucracy that tallied confessions now recorded behaviors. Even the guillotine's modern descendants, firing squads, gas chambers, humane injections, follow the same curve. Each promises progress. Each hides the blade a little better. The cruelty remains constant, only its grammar changes. And through it all, the myth of progress persists. We tell ourselves we are better than the past, that we have outgrown barbarity. But history's vocabulary of virtue never changes, only its pronunciation. Correction. Security. Peacekeeping. Each word is a translation of the same idea: obedience through pain. What truly changed was visibility. In the Middle Ages, power needed witnesses. Now it needs statistics. The scaffold has become the spreadsheet. Executions, detentions, and collateral damage are numbers, not sights. Pain, once displayed to teach obedience, is now hidden to preserve reputation. Cruelty no longer shouts, it reports. The myth of progress survives because it flatters us. It tells us that distance in time equals distance from evil. But look closely. The same architecture endures. A judge's robe replaced the inquisitor's. A psychologist's clipboard replaced the rack. The tone softened, but the question stayed identical. Will you comply? What we call civilization is merely the refinement of control. Less visible, more efficient, endlessly justified. We build prisons with better lighting, hospitals with cleaner chains, governments with nobler reasons. And we mistake polish for conscience. In the end, progress is not a line, it's a circle. Every empire begins with ideals and ends with administration. Every ideology promises redemption and discovers management. The Middle Ages had its clerks of pain. We have our analysts. Their ink is different, but the ledger is the same. When we measure our morality against the past, we find comfort in the illusion of advancement. But when we measure our systems, the hierarchies, the language, the belief that order justifies suffering, the difference fades. The method evolves. The motive endures. And the bones beneath every capital city still whisper the same warning. Humanity never stopped building its instruments of obedience. It only learned to hide them in plain sight. Every civilization believes it is different from the ones that came before. Rome said its laws were eternal. The Church said its mercy was divine. The Enlightenment said its reason was pure. And yet, beneath each empire's vocabulary lies the same handwriting, the accounting of obedience through suffering. The ledgers of medieval Europe have long turned to dust, but their logic survives. The idea that order must be paid for, that pain is a necessary expense of civilization, that someone, somewhere, must endure, so others may believe in justice. This is the true inheritance of the Middle Ages, not their cathedrals or their crusades, but their bureaucracy of agony. Today, we no longer see racks or wheels. We see detention centers, solitary cells, black sites, prisons with fluorescent lights instead of torches. The form changes, but the philosophy remains. Control the body to govern the mind. And when the public grows uneasy, the system changes its language, not its function. Torture becomes enhanced interrogation. Surveillance becomes security. Suppression becomes stability. Each new term polishes the iron until it shines like virtue. The old priests and judges would have understood perfectly. They, too, believed in the sanctity of procedure. A confession extracted by law was not cruelty, it was order. A burning sanctioned by faith was not murder, it was purification. Our age merely replaced scripture with policy, faith with metrics, parchment with data, we still worship the same idol: efficiency. Every society builds its own version of the Iron Maiden, a system that looks righteous from the outside but bleeds silently within. Ours is digital, administrative, global. Its spikes are paperwork and silence. Its priests wear suits. Its scribes use keyboards. Its prayers are algorithms that decide who deserves to suffer and who deserves to live undisturbed. Yet, the logic is ancient. Pain remains persuasive. Fear remains the fastest form of governance. And obedience, like faith, still thrives best in the dark. Look through the centuries, and you can trace a single thread, from the Inquisition's notaries to the modern bureaucrat. Both take notes. Both believe they are serving order. Both measure human life in lines of text. The only difference is tone. Where the medieval scribe wrote, "The accused confessed under question," the modern file reads, "The subject complied during interrogation." Different ink, same purpose. The philosopher Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil, the horror that comes not from demons, but from clerks. The men who follow rules, file reports, and believe their restraint makes them moral. This is the ultimate legacy of the torture chamber. Not the scream, but the silence afterward. Because systems built on pain do not die when the tools are destroyed. They survive in habits, in language, in the quiet conviction that power it is justified so long as it is efficient. History, then, is not a mirror, it is a ledger. And every generation writes new entries beside the old ones, changing the currency but not the arithmetic. Faith, gold, ideology, data, all traded for the same thing: compliance. Perhaps that is why bones last longer than words. They cannot lie about what was done to them. They carry the shape of pressure, the fractures of order, the geometry of control. Archaeology exposes what chronicles conceal, the raw record of governance written in calcium and scar. Every shattered wrist, every branded rib, every bent spine is an invoice unpaid. To open those ledgers is not to condemn the past, but to recognize its persistence. The medieval executioner no longer stands in the square, but his logic builds our institutions. The inquisitor no longer blesses the rack, but his shadow lingers in every office that says, "Procedure must be followed." Cruelty does not vanish, it migrates, and it always travels under the passport of necessity. So what, then, was the lesson of the Middle Ages? That civilization does not erase brutality, it refines it. That progress is not moral evolution. It is the professionalization of control. That every empire writes its own theology to sanctify power, and every theology builds its own instruments to defend it. The question that opened this story now returns, unanswered, but unavoidable. If pain became the proof of truth, and truth became the foundation of law, what exactly have we been building all along? Justice? Or simply a more eloquent machinery of obedience? When we close the archives and leave the ruins, only one record remains honest, the one written by the dead themselves. Their bones, their scars, their silence. They do not flatter us with progress. They remind us that cruelty, once institutionalized, never truly dies. It only changes its handwriting. So, if you value the record, not the chronicle, but the evidence, look not to the monuments, but to the fractures beneath them. Because when the ledger of power finally closes, the bones will still speak.